They did not wait for sunset or decency. The auctioneer slammed his gavel on a whiskey crate and told the crowd to open purses because a good widow made light coin, and before the echo died, 2 deputies hauled her onto a rough plank while boots scraped, and someone laughed that mercy cost more than she was worth. Heat wavered above the yard. Dust stuck to sweat on her throat. Rope bit red rings into her wrists, and pitch from a fresh post stung eyes until the place felt splintered. She steadied herself, chin high, as if bracing against a wind no one else could feel. The sheriff watched from the bottom step with his tin star heavy as a kept secret, hat brim shading the doubt he would not admit. Telling himself he was there to keep order while the town fed its appetite for spectacle, and turned another human life into noise. Men called bids that were jokes, a nickel, a bent spur, a half bottle, and the auctioneer crowed that today even a song could buy a wife. A saloon-keeper tossed a dull coin that flashed once and bragged the chorus paid the rest. A meadowlark balanced on the telegraph wire above the platform, head cocked, throat pulsing, as if the bird itself could not decide whether to sing in a yard where every voice was used to bruise. The crowd's laughter rose and fell like flies over meat. The auctioneer slapped the crate again and announced the sale complete for a song and a coin to keep it honest. The deputies jerked her forward, but she said her name was Eliza Holt, and that she would walk under her own power, and the rope creaked in protest as she did. Her voice surprised the yard. It was low and steady like river water under ice, carrying farther than shouting, and the sheriff felt it slide through the noise and settle somewhere he could not easily reach, while the saloon-keeper performed mock gallantry and invited her to sing for her supper. Eliza's eyes lifted to the wire where the meadowlark risked a bright phrase. She drew one deep breath until the rope strained her ribs, let it out slow, and squared her shoulders the way soldiers do when they stop bracing and start deciding, while the yard leaned in to be entertained. She began to hum, a thread of sound thin as quartz. The first phrase slid like a key into a lock inside the sheriff's skull, because he had heard that melody 2 months ago in the freight yard, where the marshal bled beside a toppled crate, and a night watchman whispered a prayer. The crowd jeered she could not even sing loud, yet the sheriff felt the boards tilt as the second phrase rose. Not a hymn, but a miner's timing song the marshal carried home from a strike, along with names that never reached his desk. He raised his hand to still the yard. A bent note followed, downward in the old riverman fashion marking danger on black water, and he turned so fast his neck popped. A double-take that snapped grins off 2 men because only someone from that spur would know to bend it. Eliza drew breath for the next word. The meadowlark fell silent, as if seeding the air, and the sheriff understood with cold clarity that if he let her sing on, he would have to choose a side before the town even knew there were sides. He braced, listening for the name that could break everything open and set fire to every ledger left. Eliza did not falter as the crowd pressed closer, dust and sweat thickening into a wall of heat that blurred her vision, her hum curling upward into words no one in the square expected. The song shaped itself into a lament carried from the mining camps, a dirge sung for men buried beneath collapsed timbers. But beneath its grief lay a careful code. Syllables bent where only those who had lived among Lakota scouts or miners of the Black Hills would catch the meaning. The sheriff stiffened because he heard a name half hidden in the note, a syllable that did not belong in the English tongue, and it pulled him back to the night his marshal bled out muttering about stolen rifles and traitors hiding behind church doors. The saloon-keeper laughed too loud, trying to mask his unease, and reached to pull Eliza down, but she shifted, eyes locking on the sheriff's as though daring him to deny the truth he alone could hear. Around them the crowd grew restless, half thinking they were being mocked, half certain some scandal was unfolding in front of them, and a boot heel stamped to break her rhythm, but failed because her voice carried steady like a drawn bowstring. The sheriff's throat dried, a single bead of sweat carving down from beneath his brim, his hand twitching toward the iron at his hip, though he could not yet say who the target should be. He remembered the coded whistles of Lakota scouts, who once saved his patrol from ambush, remembered how truth sometimes lived in tones rather than words, and he knew with sudden certainty that Eliza was not singing for pity, but for witness, calling out a betrayal that stretched far beyond her auction block humiliation. The meadowlark above gave a sharp cry and lifted into the open sky as if to punctuate her revelation, wings flashing against the noon glare, and the sheriff caught himself thinking that some symbols refused to be ignored. The saloon-keeper tried to laugh again, reaching for her wrist, but she snapped her arm back with the rope still binding her, the motion fierce enough to startle the crowd into silence, and the sheriff realized her defiance was not reckless, but calculated, drawing every eye so the right ears could not dismiss her. The deputies glanced toward the sheriff for orders, hands uncertain, the gavel frozen in the auctioneer's palm, and all the while Eliza's song circled back to the refrain, slipping in another hidden name. It was a name tied to land claims, railroad bribes, and whispers the sheriff had pushed aside because the cost of pursuing them was too high. Now, with the crowd leaning close and Eliza's eyes burning into his, the sheriff felt the ground tilt beneath his boots, for if he acknowledged her code, he would set himself against powerful men who had paid for silence. The crowd began murmuring, nervous that the sheriff's stillness meant more than indifference, and the saloon-keeper's grin faltered as he snapped at her to hush before she got herself strung up. Eliza held her final note long, the air vibrating with it until even the hecklers could not find their voices, and when it fell silent, the sheriff's gaze broke away in a sudden jolt. A double take again. Not because he doubted, but because he knew the truth in her eyes had just made him complicit in whatever storm was coming. And when the gavel slammed again, harder this time, the sheriff felt the hook sink deep. Her song was not over, and neither was his choice. The sheriff's boots scraped against the wooden platform as he shifted his stance, the square suddenly too tight, the sun pressing down harder as if it wanted to spotlight the truth he had just heard. Eliza stood in the dirt below, shoulders squared, the crude paint still drying across her back like a brand. But her eyes blazed with something larger than shame, something that made the sheriff's throat catch as he forced himself to look again. The first time he'd seen her, she looked like another broken woman shoved to the block, but now her song echoed in his skull and demanded he see her for what she was. Witness, messenger, a spark thrown into tinder. His deputies shifted uneasily, unsure why their lawman hesitated, and the crowd began to mutter, sensing a hesitation that did not belong in the order of an auction. The saloon-keeper barked that the sheriff ought to keep moving, that a woman's nonsense tune shouldn't stall a lawful sale, but the sheriff's second look told him more than the first. Eliza's eyes were not pleading but steady, her lips pressed into a line that spoke of defiance, her stance a quiet challenge to every man present. In that double take, he saw her as if the crowd had vanished, saw the steel in her, the trace of someone who had traveled far beyond these streets, and lived among those who spoke in codes, saw her for the danger and hope she carried. He remembered again the night of the rifles, the whispered syllables of a dying scout, and the haunting thought that betrayal was festering within the very men he worked beside. His heart kicked against his ribs because Eliza had just torn that wound open in front of the entire town. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow sliding across her face for a fleeting instant before it vanished into the light, and the sheriff swore he could feel the same pull in his chest, an urging to rise, to act, to cut free from the chains of silence he had worn too long. The auctioneer cleared his throat, rattling off numbers no one was truly hearing, and the sheriff's hand twitched toward his badge as if the weight of it could anchor him. But the badge felt heavy, dirtied by secrets, and Eliza's eyes dragged him deeper into a truth he could not unsee. A man in the crowd spat, muttering that the sheriff had gone soft, while another shouted for the sale to continue. But when the sheriff's gaze snapped back to Eliza for that second time, the hush that followed carried more judgment than their words. It was as though the entire square realized at once that something larger than an auction was unfolding, something that would not end when the gavel dropped. The saloon-keeper's face twitched with anger, sweat darkening his collar, as if he too feared the meaning laced in her song, and he stepped forward with a hand raised high, ready to drag her down and silence her himself. That movement made the sheriff's hand close around his revolver, the leather creak loud in the quiet. And, though he did not draw it, the message was clear enough. One more step, and the saloon-keeper would meet steel instead of flesh. The crowd gasped, torn between thrill and fear, and Eliza's eyes softened for the first time, not in weakness but in recognition, as if she had been waiting for him to look twice, to finally see her as more than the paint on her back. The hawk cried again in the distance, a ragged echo that made the sheriff's skin prickle, and as the gavel lifted for the final strike, everyone leaned forward because they knew the choice he made in that moment would set the course for all of them. The gavel never fell. The auctioneer's hand froze mid-air, as if the weight of the crowd's silence had locked his bones, and the sheriff's jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might crack. Eliza stood taller now, though the crude smear of paint across her back still screamed of humiliation, but she bore it like armor, her eyes drilling into him with something sharper than plea. It was recognition, as though she had been waiting for this very square, this very hour. A ripple moved through the people pressed shoulder to shoulder, whispers riding the heat like snakes across the dust, words half-breathed yet heavy enough to tilt the balance of the moment. Some muttered that the sheriff had lost his edge, others that Eliza's voice carried Lakota truth, the kind whispered only in fireside circles when the prairies themselves held their breath. The sheriff's hand hovered near his revolver still, not from threat, but from the knowledge that this gathering had shifted from a sale into a spark that could set the whole town alight. A drunk near the back barked out a laugh, demanding to know if the sheriff had fallen in love with an outlaw's wife, and the words caught like tinder, swelling into a roar of speculation until the sheriff cut it down with a single sharp command that cracked across the square like a whip. The sound carried farther than his voice ever had before, silencing men and scattering children who clung to skirts. But the sheriff knew even as quiet settled that he had crossed a line. No longer neutral, no longer law's detached face. He was tethered now, bound to Eliza's fate, because he had refused to look away. At his side, Deputy Harper shifted uneasily, his eyes darting not to Eliza, but to the saloon-keeper, whose lips curled into a thin smile that reeked of knowledge. The sheriff caught the exchange and understood. Harper had known something, maybe even helped, and now the threads were tightening. Eliza's voice broke the stillness again, low but carrying, telling the sheriff that names had been traded in the night, that silver had clinked in back rooms, and that the truth sat buried beneath the very dust they all stood upon. The hawk's shadow skimmed across the square once more, scattering whispers like dry leaves, and the sheriff's throat burned with the weight of what he dared not yet admit. The saloon-keeper stepped forward, his boots grinding against the dirt, his voice oily as he demanded the sheriff step aside and let the sale finish. He spoke of order, of contracts, of the town's dignity, but the sheriff heard only the rattle of chains behind his words, the clink of coin dripping through the cracks. Eliza lifted her chin, meeting the saloon-keeper's glare without flinching, and her silence was louder than any song. She had said enough to mark him guilty, and the sheriff's refusal to act would brand him the same. The square seemed to lean in, the weight of choice pressing heavier, and still the gavel hovered above the block like an executioner's blade, suspended by unseen hands. The sheriff's badge felt like lead, his revolver heavier still, and he realized the question was no longer whether he would intervene, but whether the town would stand when he did. The whispers thickened again, running like smoke through the crowd, and every eye locked on him as if daring him to move first. He knew the moment was a fuse, and all it lacked was the spark of a single step. The sheriff finally stepped forward, the sun catching the silver of his badge so that it flared like a signal across the square, and the sound of his boots grinding the dirt echoed louder than the murmur of 100 restless mouths. Eliza's eyes followed him, steady, as if she had known he would choose this path. But her breath hitched when the saloon keeper shifted his weight and rested one hand on the butt of his pistol. The crowd stiffened, tension crackling like dry brush before a firestorm, and somewhere in the distance the hawk let out a sharp cry that cut through the air with uncanny timing. The sheriff raised his voice, not to command this time, but to declare, telling them all that no woman would be sold under his watch, not with paint scrawled across her back as though she were cattle. Gasps rippled through the gathering, disbelief followed by a hum of nervous laughter. But the sheriff's words burned hotter than the August sun, searing into every ear and leaving no room for retreat. The saloon keeper's smirk faltered, though his eyes still gleamed with the kind of danger that thrives in corners and shadows. He accused the sheriff of betrayal, of taking the side of an outlaw's woman against the town that had fed and raised him, and for a moment the accusation swayed the air, some townsfolk nodding, others spitting in the dust. Eliza's voice rose then, sharp and sudden, cutting through their doubt. She spoke of nights spent listening at doors not meant for her ears, of promises whispered in smoke-filled rooms, and of a plan to sell not just her body but the land her late husband had defended with blood. She told them of names, familiar ones, men standing in that very crowd who had bid not with money but with silence, complicit in turning her shame into their profit, faces blanched, fists clenched. The sheriff felt the ground tilt beneath him, the truth cracking open like parched earth after rain. Deputy Harper took a step back, eyes darting between his superior and the saloon keeper, sweat dripping down his temple as though Eliza's words had dragged his conscience into daylight. The sheriff saw it and knew Harper's loyalty was brittle, his fear louder than his oath. The hawk wheeled overhead, its shadow slicing across the saloon keeper's face, and for an instant the man looked less like a merchant of pleasure and more like prey marked by a hunter's eye. Still, the gavel hung frozen in the auctioneer's hand, the moment stretched tight as wire, every second waiting to snap. The sheriff's voice dropped low, a warning threaded with iron, telling the saloon keeper that this ended now, that no more women would bear chains in a town sworn to law. The saloon keeper sneered, but beneath it his jaw twitched, the first tremor of unease. The crowd leaned in, caught between fear and fury, between the safety of silence and the storm of truth. A boy no older than 12 shouted from the back that Eliza was right, that he had seen coin change hands in the saloon, and the words struck like a stone hurled through glass. Murmurs became growls, growls edged toward shouts. The sheriff saw it unfold. This was no longer about one woman, but about the whole town's rot exposed under a merciless sun. His hand brushed his revolver, not yet drawing, but the promise of steel hummed in the air. And then the hawk screamed again, a piercing call that silenced all doubt, and the sheriff understood. The fight was no longer a question of if, but when. and the first move would decide whether blood or justice claimed the square. The square felt like a tinderbox, every eye locked on the sheriff and the saloon keeper, waiting for the spark that would set it all aflame. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, thick with dust and whispers, and Eliza could feel her heart hammering so hard she thought it might shatter her ribs. The sheriff's jaw was set like stone, but inside he felt the weight of a choice that could tear the town apart. If he faltered, law would crumble. If he pressed forward, blood might soak the ground. The saloon-keeper's grin returned, thin and dangerous, his pistol now dangling loosely from his fingers as if daring the sheriff to draw first. He spat into the dirt, his voice rising in a taunt that echoed against the clapboard walls, calling Eliza a liar, a whore dressed in pity, a voice that belonged in his saloon, not in any church. The words hit her like blows, yet she did not flinch, standing taller, her back still stung with the paint of shame, but her face unbroken. She sang then, soft but clear, her voice trembling at first and then gaining strength, a hymn her mother had taught her when she was a girl, one about light-breaking chains and rivers carrying sins away. The sound cut across the rage, piercing hearts more surely than any bullet, and the townsfolk shifted, some wiping their eyes, others looking away as if ashamed. The sheriff saw the effect, saw how the power of her song could tilt the balance, and he knew in that instant she was no victim, but the flame that might purify them all. Yet the saloon-keeper's sneer deepened, and his hand twitched toward his gun. Deputy Harper's breath caught, his face pale as he realized what was about to happen, and his trembling hand went to his own revolver. The sheriff barked his name, sharp enough to freeze him in place, but Harper's eyes burned with fear and doubt. His loyalty stretched to the breaking point. The hawk screamed again above them, circling as though it too sensed the fracture widening below. The sheriff's hand hovered over his holster, the leather creaking with the pressure of his palm, sweat sliding down his temple, every nerve waiting for the inevitable. The crowd surged forward a step, the energy shifting, no longer a mob but a storm seeking direction, looking to him for justice or chaos. Eliza's song faltered for a moment, her eyes locking with his, and he felt the weight of her trust heavier than the badge pinned to his chest. The saloon-keeper laughed then, a sound like broken glass, and accused the sheriff of being bewitched, of letting a widow's tears blind him to his duty. He shouted that this woman's song was nothing but a trick, and that the law would crumble if she was allowed to stand free. The sheriff's blood boiled. The word struck too close to the doubt gnawing at his own heart. For a heartbeat he thought of walking away, of letting the town devour itself. But then Eliza's voice rose again, stronger now, and the hymn turned to a cry that seemed to call not just for mercy, but for courage. The saloon-keeper's finger curled tighter on the trigger, and the sheriff knew the breaking point had arrived. Everything, the town's soul, his own honor, Eliza's very life, balanced on the next breath, the next sound, the next twitch of a finger. And as the hawk's shadow swept across them once more, the sheriff understood there would be no turning back. The gunshot cracked like thunder, but it was not the sheriff's revolver that spoke first. It was Deputy Harper's trembling hand that squeezed off the shot, the bullet flying wild and sparking off the hitching post. The sudden blast sent townsfolk screaming, scattering back against storefronts, mothers clutching children, men stumbling over their own boots. The saloon-keeper roared with rage, firing in return, his bullet tearing a plank off the sheriff's office wall. In the chaos, Eliza's song faltered, her voice drowned out by the eruption of fear, but she stood rooted, refusing to cower, her hands clutching the wooden rail of the auction block until splinters cut into her palms. The sheriff barked orders, his voice booming, commanding Harper to stand down even as he drew his own weapon at last, leveling it square at the saloon-keeper's chest. The hawk screamed above, circling lower now, its shadow sweeping across Eliza like a shield, and she lifted her chin, her breath trembling as if drawing strength from the creature's cry. The saloon-keeper sneered, his eyes fever-bright, shouting that this was his town, his law, that no widow's voice would overturn the order he had built in whiskey and sin. He leveled his pistol at Eliza, intent on silencing her forever, and in that frozen instant the sheriff felt his soul ignite with a fire fiercer than fear. He stepped forward into the line of aim, his voice ringing clear, declaring that if the bullet flew it would strike him first, not her. The crowd gasped, the tension snapping tighter, and in that instant Eliza began to sing again, her voice cutting through the gun smoke, a trembling hymn that rose like a prayer over the square. Her song wove through the air, soft at first, then swelling into a defiance that could not be denied, each note flaring against the saloon-keeper's hate like sparks on dry grass. The people shifted, their eyes torn between the sheriff's steady stance and the widow's unbroken song, and something inside them began to stir, a memory of decency, of truth. Harper lowered his gun, his shoulders shaking, tears carving tracks through the dust on his cheeks. The sheriff saw it, saw the deputy's shame burning into something steadier, and he knew the tide was turning. But the saloon-keeper's finger twitched again, his rage boiling into recklessness, and the sheriff's pulse hammered, waiting for the explosion. A hush fell over the square, broken only by Eliza's voice, until even the trembling of the crowd seemed to fade, as though all creation paused to witness the stand being made. The sheriff felt the weight of the moment pressing on his chest like an anvil, his hand steady on his revolver, his boots planted in the dust that now felt sacred beneath his feet. He thought of the town's future, of children growing up under shadows or under light, and in that thought he felt his fear harden into resolve. The saloon-keeper snarled, cursing them all, his eyes flicking like a cornered animal, and the sheriff knew the standoff could not last much longer. The hymn reached its peak, a note so pure and aching that even the gunmen stilled, and in that trembling moment, every soul in the square knew that the next heartbeat would decide not just Eliza's fate, but the soul of the town itself. The saloon-keeper's finger pulled, the pistol bucking in his hand, the shot tearing through the square with the weight of finality. But before it struck flesh, the sheriff's revolver roared in reply, his bullet finding its mark with merciless accuracy. The saloon-keeper staggered, a look of shock frozen on his face as the gun clattered from his grip, and blood spread dark across his vest. He dropped to his knees in the dust, curses bubbling weakly from his mouth, but his empire of fear crumbled with him. A scream rose from the crowd, women clutching children, men ducking as the last echo of gunfire rolled between the wooden buildings. Harper, pale and trembling, lunged forward, knocking aside the outlaw's second as he tried to raise a weapon in the chaos, the two of them tumbling into the dirt with fists and fury. The hawk shrieked again, diving low until its wings brushed the air above Eliza, as though shielding her from the last dregs of violence. Her song faltered, then ceased, her lips parted in a gasp as she clutched her chest, the echoes of her hymn still ringing like a ghost among the rafters and rooftops. The sheriff holstered his weapon slowly, his eyes locked on the dying saloon-keeper, who spat blood and hatred, rasping that the town would never be free, that fear would always win. The sheriff shook his head, his voice calm and iron, telling him that fear had lost the moment Eliza dared to sing. The outlaw collapsed fully then, his face settling into a twisted mask, his last breath leaving him unheard by anyone who cared to listen. The square fell into stunned silence, broken only by Harper's ragged breathing as he rose, bruised but standing, dragging the outlaw's second with shackled wrists to the sheriff's feet. The people began to stir, first whispers, then cheers, then weeping as the reality of what had just happened settled on them like sunlight after storm clouds part. Eliza swayed, her strength drained, and the sheriff leapt forward, steadying her with a firm hand as her knees threatened to buckle. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with tears that reflected relief and sorrow all at once, whispering that she had thought she would die with her song unfinished. He told her, softly but fierce, that her voice had finished what his bullets never could, that she had broken the chains on every soul who heard her. The hawk circled one last time before gliding toward the distant hills, its shadow stretching long across the square like a benediction. Harper knelt before the sheriff, voice cracking as he begged forgiveness for the weakness that had nearly damned them all, but the sheriff laid a steady hand on his shoulder, saying that repentance was shown in deeds, not pleas, and today he had chosen rightly in the end. The townsfolk pressed forward then, not in fear, but in awe, their faces lit with the glow of something long forgotten. Hope. Mothers held their children close, fathers tipped hats, and old men muttered prayers of thanks into the dusty wind. The sheriff stood straighter, the weight of leadership pressing heavier than ever, but no longer crushing, for he was no longer alone. And in the center of it all, Eliza stood, with bloodied palms and tear-streaked cheeks, her eyes lifted toward the heavens, as though she saw in the sky a promise that what had been broken might, at last, be made whole. The sheriff looked out over his people, his voice steady as he declared that this town was theirs again, built not on fear, but on truth. Yet even as cheers erupted, he knew shadows lingered beyond the horizon, and the price of peace was never paid in full. The chapter closed on the sheriff's gaze locking with Eliza's, a silent vow passing between them that whatever storms came next, they would not face them alone. The echoes of cheering had hardly settled before the rattle of hooves thundered at the edge of town, the sound sharp and urgent, like the drums of war rolling closer with every beat. Dust rose in a thick curtain, and out of it came a half-dozen riders, lean men with bandanas drawn and rifles gleaming in the fading light. The last remnants of the saloon-keeper's crew who had been waiting beyond the hills for their master's call. Panic rippled through the crowd, women pulling children back, men stepping aside in terror as though the old order had returned in an instant. The sheriff's jaw tightened as he stepped forward, his hand falling to his revolver, his body planted firm in the center of the square, as if daring the riders to cross that line. Eliza, still weak but steadied by Harper, felt her heart seize with dread. But then the hawk cried once more, its wings flashing against the lowering sky, as if reminding her that her song was not finished until hope was sealed in victory. The riders pulled up in a spray of dirt, their leader spitting at the ground, mocking the sheriff for thinking one bullet could topple years of fear. He raised his rifle and laughed, promising to drag Eliza into the dust and show the town that her voice was worth nothing when smothered in blood. The crowd shrank back, but then something shifted. An old man stepped forward, clutching a rusted shotgun he had long hidden away, his voice trembling but defiant as he said no more would the town kneel. A mother followed, lifting a lantern high, her face lit with firelight and resolve. One by one, others stepped in, forming a wall behind the sheriff, fragile but unyielding, their fear burning away in the glow of shared courage. The sheriff glanced at them, a flicker of pride cutting through his tension, then turned back to the riders, telling them plainly that the time for shadows had ended, and if they wanted to test the town's strength, they'd have to bleed for it. The outlaw leader sneered, kicked his horse forward, and the square exploded with motion. Rifles cracked, pistols barked, men dove for cover, but this time the town did not scatter. Harper wrestled a fallen rifle from the dirt, firing with a shout that echoed like redemption for every weak moment he'd lived. The old man's shotgun boomed, the blast throwing one rider from his saddle. Sparks flew as the mother's lantern shattered on the ground, fire leaping to hay and scattering the enemy's mounts into chaos. The sheriff moved like lightning, his revolver steady and deadly, each shot measured, each strike a reminder that justice carried more weight than terror. In the midst of it all, Eliza found herself singing again, her voice cutting clear even through gunfire, a hymn not of sorrow but of defiance, and the people rallied at the sound, their fear replaced by fury. The hawk dove once more, talons grazing the face of a rider who screamed as his horse bolted, leaving the fight in tatters. Within minutes it was over, the last of the riders broken, their weapons scattered, their power undone. The sheriff lowered his revolver, chest heaving, eyes burning with fire as he looked across the bodies sprawled in the dust. Silence returned, heavy and stunned, but not the silence of fear. It was the silence of victory, fragile yet undeniable. The sheriff turned to Eliza, her voice still trembling on the last note of her hymn, and told her that tonight her song had become the shield of the people. But even as the townsfolk gathered, lifting their heads and clinging to one another, the sheriff's eyes drifted toward the horizon where the sun bled into darkness, and he knew one final reckoning still waited before peace could truly be theirs. The night settled heavy over the town, yet the air hummed with something it had never held before. The trembling birth of courage. The saloon smoldered in ruins behind them, the outlaws lay scattered, and the townsfolk stood bruised but unbroken, their eyes wide as if they were seeing themselves for the first time. Eliza stood in the middle of the square, her hair loose around her shoulders, her dress torn at the seams, and yet she seemed taller than anyone there, her voice still ringing faintly in the rafters of memory, a hymn no bullet had silenced. The sheriff stepped toward her, holstering his revolver, his weathered face etched with exhaustion and awe, and in that silence he told her she had given them back more than hope. She had given them a reason to fight for their own souls. Harper, leaning on his rifle, swallowed hard, his shame burned away in the fire of her courage, and when he met her eyes, he saw not a widow left to suffer, but a woman reborn in truth and defiance. The people gathered close, murmurs spreading, some weeping openly, others whispering thanks, as though afraid too loud a voice might break the spell she had woven. A child tugged at her skirt, holding out a wildflower he had clutched through the chaos, and she knelt, pressing it gently to her chest, her tears finally spilling as she whispered that beauty had survived after all. The sheriff raised his hand, steadying the crowd, and spoke plain words. That no man or gang or judge would ever again decide what a woman's worth was, that the strength they found tonight was their own to keep. His voice carried, steady as an oath, and in that moment the town seemed to rise taller on its foundations. Above, the hawk circled one last time, its wings silvered by moonlight, a sentinel against the dark, before gliding silently into the night, as though its duty was complete. Eliza lifted her face to the stars, and for the first time since her husband's death, she did not feel crushed by grief, but held up by something larger, by the people who had heard her voice and answered it with fire. The bells of the church, long silent, began to toll, struck not by the hand of a priest, but by a boy with dirt-streaked cheeks, who said the sound meant they were still alive. The notes rolled across the valley, mingling with the faint trace of her song, and the town stood shoulder to shoulder beneath it, no longer a place of shadows but a place of promise. Eliza closed her eyes, and in her heart she carried an image she knew would endure, not of humiliation at the auction block, but of her voice rising above smoke and gunfire, binding broken people into something unbreakable. As dawn threatened the horizon, the sheriff placed a hand on her shoulder and said softly that when the sun rose, they would begin again. And this time they would build on truth. She nodded, her voice quiet but steady, telling him she would sing at the work, for songs had power, and hers belonged to all of them now. And so, in the ash and silence of battle, the widow who had been sold for a song became the song itself. A living anthem carried in the hearts of a town reborn, her voice destined to echo long after the dust of their sins had blown away.